Welcome to our new series of meeting Holocaust researchers. I will say a few words. I was asked by Ami here, is the Corona time bad or good for us? So I'll say this. This is a real shocking moment for the world. And I'll ask you everyone to mute yourself apart from the speakers. This is a real seminal point in world history. We still don't know how the world will look. And how the world, our professional world, will look after we get out of this situation. Yet, we found that one of the greatest hits for us as academics is that we lost the connection between one another. Everyone was sitting in his room, teaching his students through his computer, and some places you couldn't even get out of your home on lockdown. So this is certainly not an easy period for anyone. And what we felt is that the Zoom gave us an opportunity to start meeting people and talking to people, and even strengthening the field, not only surviving, having it survive the situation. Of course, we know we're Western Galilee is a small college in the northern corner of Israel, but the Zoom actually, the period enabled us to do things that we would not do regularly. We usually have international conferences. Many people here attended our conferences. We usually get 30 speakers in, or 35 speakers for 3 days. It costs us, we have to raise the funding and everything. Now, there's a lot of things we can do with the new situation. We had the biggest Holocaust online conference a month ago with 280 registries, 2 days of talks. We had Yuda Bauer give the keynote without even having to leave his assisted living home. So we actually, and all that project is on the web. The program, all the sessions are on YouTube, all the things we did for that conference. Now we wanted to build this further. So what we have now is this new series of meeting Holocaust researchers. We wanted to start with Dieter Pohl, and Daniela will introduce him, but I will say that we are having Christopher Browning speak here in 3 weeks. We just started sending out the invitations. Just a minute. Okay, sorry. So we have Christopher Browning will speak in 3 weeks. 3 weeks after that, Chavi Dreyfus Ben Sasson will speak here. And the plan is what we are planning for the end of August. We are going to have a networking event for Holocaust researchers. We're planning on doing speed dating on Zoom for researchers from all over the world. We'll send out information on time. The idea is that people will have time to sit in small groups, what we call on Zoom breakout rooms. And but this is not now. Now we have our first, the opening our series is Professor Dieter Pohl, and Daniela, who is teaching in our program, will introduce him.
Thank you, Boaz. So I have 2 initial announcements. First, this session will be recorded and uploaded to our website. Second, please keep your microphones at mute. And if you have any questions, please write them down on the chat. And after the lecture, Ronnie and I will read it to them. We'll read it. So thanks everyone for taking the time to be with us today. And especially you, Professor Pohl, for immediately agreeing to speak in this event. The Holocaust Studies program at Western Galilee College in Akko, Israel, decided to take action in these challenging times of the coronavirus, which presented difficulties and even feelings of loneliness and isolation of Holocaust scholars from the entire world. We decided to organize some virtual events and to share new researches and discussions with all of you. The world as we know it has changed, and I believe that all of us feel some kind of uncertainty regarding future researching and teaching our field. I met Professor Pohl in a couple of real-life conferences and events. The first one was a great workshop in Lviv, Ukraine, organized by ERI. Despite being a leading Holocaust historian, Professor Pohl is also taking time to promote and support young scholars. He lives in Germany and teaches at the University of Klagenfurt, Austria. His research interests include the Second World War in Europe and Asia, mass violence in the 20th century, the history of the Soviet Union, the Holocaust in Galicia, the National Socialist occupation regime and violent crimes, research on the impact of war, the history of communist systems after 1945, and the contemporary history of Poland and Ukraine. He authored several books on the Holocaust and German occupation in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, and is co-editor of the volume document series on the persecution and murder of European Jews, Die Verfolgung und Ermordung der europäischen Juden. Is being published since 2007 and is also translated now to English, at least in part. So Professor Dieter Pohl, thank you so much for being with us today. It is an honor for us to host you, and the floor and the screen is yours.
Yeah, I just want to start with returning the thanks, of course. Thanks for the invitation. And actually, I was not fully aware that there's such a variety of prestigious Holocaust historians. So as you will see in the next minutes, the title of my presentation is Some Basic Problems of Holocaust Research, and I'm going to be very basic, I think. So I hope that there is something for everybody more or less included. What I have to say in advance, and I'm of course coming from I would say pretty German tradition of Holocaust historiography, which is focusing on politics, on organizations, and on perpetrators. I have lots of children here in my earphone, but these are not mine.
I'm trying to find who to mute.
Yeah, but that's okay. Yeah.
Please mute yourself, everyone.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe a family debate also.
So you can mute everyone with, if you're the organizer.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
Okay. Except me, I hope. Okay, so I just wanted to say I'm coming from this German tradition, or now it's already an old German tradition of perpetrator history in general, not only the perpetrators in person, but also the organization, the politics, and so on. And recently, more or less, we got some extra fame. You might have read the Haaretz article by Jan Grabowski with his frontal attack on German Holocaust historiography, which addressed me, amongst others. Especially, I had a rather unpleasant debate with him, but I'm coming back to that later. So what are you going to hear? So unfortunately, my PowerPoint doesn't work. So now here we have it. So I'm addressing 9 basic problems of Holocaust history, actually not of research. A short addresses this problem of how to conceptualize the origins of the Holocaust. And I think that's still one of the major problems of historiography. I mean, that's an old subject, of course, of decades of discussions and so on. And so I probably won't say a lot new about it. Then I want to address the specificity of the Nazi system and how it's related to the Holocaust. I have debates on the Nazi dictatorship. And then I come more or less to the core of the purpose of my presentation. The war, what is the relationship between the war and the Holocaust? And more recently, what is the relationship between empire building and the Holocaust, which has been in debate. Then I come to one of my favorite subjects, is the Holocaust within Nazi violence in general. And then, of course, Jan Grabowski gets his share with collaboration in the Holocaust and what it means. I shortly want to address the limits of mass violence, because I think that's an approach which is still underestimated. And then the last 2 points is how did the Holocaust affect the societies where it happened? And finally, the question, how can we place the Holocaust in history? Of course, that's a giant debate, but this is more my personal opinion I want to present here. Let me start with this, origins of the Holocaust. I mean, we had, I think from the 1960s till the 1980s, maybe 1990s, this classical narrative that the Holocaust originated in the German and Austrian anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century. Names like Schöne, Lueger, and so on, which were classical, influenced Hitler, and Hitler finally murdered the Jews during the Second World War. This was the classical intentionalist approach, and there have been mountains of books on that, so I cannot add a lot of new stuff. But my question is, in first place, about anti-Semitism. Of course, we cannot write Holocaust history without anti-Semitism, though some authors say so. But the question is the anti-Semitism as racism. I think that's still a big problem, because we have now for some years a debate on whether the Nazi state was actually a racial state, like the book title by Burley and Wippermann says. And my first argument is that there were three different and, in a certain sense, incompatible racisms in Nazism included. And the first one is the classical anthropological racism, which comes from the colonial world, more or less, and which was also applied to the Slavs, for example, this hierarchy of racial value. The second one is more specific for some modern regimes. That's a eugenic racism, which focuses on the own society and the people with, how it's called, the genetic deficiencies and so on, Erbkranke and so on. And the third element is anti-Semitism. And the thing is, all the three are not very compatible. And I think the anti-Semitism cannot be just subsumed as racism, but it's a very complex, I would say, political, cultural, and only in third row biological concept. So the question, what does racism mean? And we have the problem, I think, that anti-Semitism is well researched, especially, of course, it started Germany and Austria, but only up till 1933. And now we have a wave of studies on all of Europe into the war, but we don't have it for Germany. That is the question, how was anti-Semitism like in Nazi Germany? Because everybody thinks it's self-explaining. The Nazis were anti-Semitic, so actually not much research necessary. And there is, for example, Jeffrey Herf was one of the few who wrote a book on anti-Semitic propaganda, but there are lots of problems with anti-Semitism under Nazism. For example, the Nazis had a big debate on who is a Jew and who not in 1934, 1935, and only a certain direction was taken of that. The anti-Semitism is the classical explanation for the Holocaust, but now all these new elements entered the last 3 decades into the discourse, and especially the violence. How is violence accepted and applied in the political sphere, especially after the First World War, which was a pretty violent era with a lot of anti-Semitic violence. Think of Ukraine, think of Hungary, to a certain extent also in Central Europe. And then we were at the problem, what is the relation between fascism and the Holocaust? And my belief is that fascism is only indirectly related to the Holocaust, because fascism is in first place an anti-communist, very young and even anti-bourgeois movement, which is very violent, but it has not been throughout anti-Semitic. If we look at Western European fascism, at Italian fascism, only during the mid-30s they become anti-Semitic, more or less. But I think it's the merger of these old racist and German völkisch structure with young fascism, this violent political movement, which stands for the specificity of National Socialism. Of course, we have now the new debate on did the Holocaust originate only in Germany, in brackets in Austria, or was it a European continuity? We have all these studies on collaboration and anti-Semitism out of Germany. And this is very important, but it poses a big problem for us to conceptualize now what is the prehistory. Is the prehistory pan-European, or is it just German? So we have to decide on it. And I think the most important discovery, if you can call it like that, is the case of Romania, because Romania is the only state which had its own Holocaust, you can say. The Holocaust, you know, in Bessarabia, Northern Bukovina, and Transnistria. And of course, in Romania, you have you have a completely different prehistory of the Holocaust, like in Germany. You don't have this totalitarian dictatorship, if you look at 1941, which lasts for 8 years in Germany. And you even have, it's almost paradox, a government which submerged, which more or less destroyed Romanian fascism, the Iron Guard, and then killed all the Jews. And that's one of the problems. In the summarize, I would say we cannot speak of a unified prehistory of the Holocaust, and we have to speak about several prehistories in the plural to come to terms with that. My second problem is the relationship of the Nazi system. So what was the Nazi system? We have these traditional explanations, like it's a totalitarian dictatorship, but the research of all the last decades has shown it's not so totalitarian as one might think. But what is important for the Holocaust is how, what is the dynamic of Nazism and how does it work more or less as a state? And there were older theories like the dual state, that there is a traditional state with formal rules, and the new state, which is more revolutionary and which more or less comes in place of the traditional state. So this dualism. And for other historians, for example, claimed that the Nazis used and misused the old state to use their own terms, but they destroyed it. For example, Hans Mommsen claimed it. But I think the new interpretation is that of a new statehood, neue Staatlichkeit, in German historiography, which says that the Nazis more or less changed the German system and only organized it according to the major tasks which were necessary for them. That's the war, the armament, for example, that's occupation, and that's the Holocaust. So we have a new system within a short time. A factor which has been underestimated, I think, is the role of law. Germany in 1933 was a highly law-abiding state, a Rechtsstaat, and it's very important to see how this declined, how the Nazis destroyed this Rechtsstaat. And we have now different steps, and it's not a real continuity. In 1933, we see a period of direct terror in the streets, more or less, and this does not return in Germany until the end of the war. So the term of terror is applicable to the early Nazi rule, to the late Nazi rule, and to the occupation rule in order to suppress resistance there. Then we have the isolated violence, and that's the importance about the concentration camps. The concentration camps enabled the Nazis to have a more or less a lawless space within their own country. And that's, in a certain sense, the forerunner of the occupied countries. So you can say, of course, exaggerating, that Poland was a big concentration camps. The Nazis could do there what they wanted. And that's the important thing, that the violence completely changed when it's being directed against the outer enemy. The external violence is different from the internal violence. If we follow the course of the anti-Jewish policy before 1939, we see more or less also this, what Karl Schleunis called the twisted road to Auschwitz, phases of anti-Jewish drive and a retreat, especially in the mid-1930s, and then, of course, in 1938. In general, there were approximately 3,000 to 4,000 Jews killed within Germany and then Austria before the beginning of the war, and most of these were individual killings. There's no mass murder prior to the beginning of the war. And all in all, about 10,000 Germans and Austrians were killed before the war. Another feature of the Nazi system is the improvising nature. It's radical, but it's improvised. And the planning actually for the war, and this includes then the Holocaust, only starts when the war begins. So we have no real pre-planning for what to do with occupied Poland. Only in September, October 1939, all the agencies start to set up plans, and giant plans, for example, to deport 3 million Poles within some months. And all of this breaks down. It doesn't work. They cannot realize it. But what the Nazis do, and that's in the system, they don't compromise, but they set up a new plan, and it's even more radical. And the General Plan East to restructure Eastern Europe is one of these plans, which is also not being realized, but the so-called final solution has been realized. So this is important as a feature of the Nazi system. Now I come to the relationship between the war and the Holocaust. I think one of the very basic things which is almost non-existent in the Holocaust literature is that the war against Poland was an unplanned war. The Nazi war plan was directed against Czechoslovakia and afterwards against France. And only in 1939 decided Hitler to lead war against Poland. Poland was envisaged as a minor partner in Hitler's system. So the Poles should help Germany lead war against France. So their agrarian basis, more or less, and then the German troops should be deployed for war against the Soviet Union. So I think this is an important element, that there is a kind of decision in May 1939 to invade Poland, and this was one of the most decisive steps towards the Holocaust. Because when the Germans attacked Poland, they started with a system with mass murder, with systematic killing, not only of Jews, but in the majority mentally ill and the Polish intelligentsia. And we see this on a minor scale again in Yugoslavia, 1941. Yugoslavia at that point was an ally of the Germans, and they even had a small anti-Semitic law. in independent Yugoslavia. So everything looked fine until March 1941, when there was this coup d'etat in Belgrade, and then Hitler switched to attack Yugoslavia. And what happened afterwards was also very unplanned. Hitler planned to install a conservative government in occupied Croatia with the Peasant Party, which was pretty conservative, you can say, but the Peasant Party leadership denied this collaboration, and thus a comparatively small group, the Ustascha, came to power with Mussolini's support. And the important thing is the Ustascha right away started to kill Serbs, opponents, and Jews already in April 1941, beginning before the beginning of the war against the Soviet Union. With the war against the Soviet Union, we also again see now big concepts, unlike in Poland, for example, the hunger plan, but also very early resettlement plans and so on. But we know very few about the concept for the Soviet Jews. What we know is that it was probably planned to kill all male Jews of military age. And again, this developed over weeks and over months inside the Soviet Union. That's quite common knowledge. Most of you know that. But it's important also to see the cause of the war in order to put the Holocaust in the war context. And I say there were the two big dictators made two, basically had two failures in 1941, which were extremely important for the cause of the Holocaust. The first is Stalin's failure to foresee the immediate attack of the Germans, and that's why the Wehrmacht conquered within 2 weeks all the areas where the Shtetl inside Western Soviet Union were. This whole belt from the Baltics to Eastern Poland, Western part of Belarus, Ukraine, and so on down to Bessarabia. So this was very important because there was no chance for these communities to escape. Only 5 to 10% of the Jews were able to escape during that period. If you go further from September 1941, the escape rate, which was much higher, it was even 2/3 at the Dnieper line. On the other hand, it's important to see that also Hitler failed, of course, because he didn't win his blitzkrieg as he had planned him, and it's unclear what effect that had on the cause of the anti-Jewish policy. And Christopher Browning once said the state of euphoria was important to unleash the final solution. But there are other theories which say the opposite, that it was Hitler's failure which unleashed the final solution. I would think that Hitler interpreted both events, both the success and the failure, as important steps towards the final solution. And then we have this, the importance of the ongoing war in the Soviet Union, of course, gave a perfect pretext for mass murder of the Jews. That's also important, that we have an ongoing war inside the Soviet Union. And then the relationship between war and the Holocaust is more or less disconnected for a while in 1942, when the mass killing reached its height, and then returned in 1943, 1944. Also important, the fact that the United States, Brendan Sims in his new Hitler biography says it's only the United States is important for Hitler. I don't think that was the case, but for Hitler it was, he always thought, I have to win the Continental War before the United States enter the war, and that also affected the Holocaust in a certain sense. So he tried to kill the Jews before the United States unleashed their economic power in order to intervene. And finally, the cause of the war is very important, especially after the Battle of Stalingrad, because Hitler had to apply some kind of Holocaust diplomacy. That means he put pressure on his allies, the Axis states, to extradite their Jews, and the worse the war went, the less they were ready to extradite their Jews, with a strange exception of Bulgaria, which extradited the Jews of its occupied territories after Stalingrad, when everybody knew that the war is going to be lost. But you see, for example, Romania switches its policies, and in 1944, you see it in July 1944, Hungary, out of strategic reasons, switches its forces. That's the question of the war and the Holocaust. And I say, at least in the first years, it's very tightly connected. In the last years, it's tightly connected. The next problem is the relationship between empire and Holocaust, and this has been discussed for a while. And we currently, sorry, I have to close my window. This has been discussed for a while during the 1990s, at least in German historiography. One of the book titles is called From Windhoek to Auschwitz. More or less, was there continuity from the German colonial massacres in Southwest and Eastern Africa at the beginning of the century to the mass murder in Eastern Europe? The majority of the German historians refuted this argument because they said that the contexts are completely different, that the international situation was completely different. For example, we know now that the British were not very unsympathetic to the German violence in the colonial wars. And we have, of course, the First World War as a kind of block, which more or less breaks this continuity. But this is a long discussion, maybe we can continue in it. Nevertheless, I think that a new empire building took place during the 1930s, 1940s, and this was highly relevant for the Holocaust. And the new about it in relationship to the colonialism were several factors. The one was the fragmentation of international relations. Colonialism up till the First World War was a consensual thing among the European states. It was not during the 1930s. When the Italians attacked Abyssinia, when the Japanese attacked China or occupied Manchuria and so on. So the politics broke apart, but also the world market broke apart. And then it's one of the main reasons why the Germans wanted to have such a big empire, because they knew the world market is breaking apart. The British, French have their own empires, no problem, but we don't have one. And in the Japanese case, that's quite clear. The difference is also that the international system was breaking apart, but the German society was aligning itself behind Hitler, and that's completely different from the colonial policy around 1900. And my main argument is that it's a continental imperialism. It's not overseas colonialism, and this continental imperialism of both the Japanese, which were on an island, of course, it's not directly continental, and the Germans, and to a certain extent, also the Italian attack on Abyssinia, were against highly developed cultures. And that's why all of these new imperialists knew they had to apply a lot of violence to break this resistance, to break these structures. And in the German case, it's of course the most radical because they fought against the Soviet Union, which was considered as the empire of evil. And that's completely different, for example, from colonizing a South African area. Included in this imperialism, and especially in the German case, was the intent to restructure the East. All this general plan East, planning, 30 million Slavs to be deported, 50 million Slavs to be deported. That's very specific about the German case. And if we see the development towards the so-called final solution, we have a discussion between the center and the periphery. That means most of the initiatives to kill came from the occupied territories. They said, we have a so-called Jewish problem, please do something. And the Berlin people in most cases say, do something yourself, like Hans Frank in one speech quoted. The empire in the East, which is in first place Poland, the Baltics, and the Soviet Union, was of course a specific space of lawlessness, like I called it, a big concentration camp. There was no public sphere, no control. There was no international interest in that, or very limited to the Polish government in exile. This is again a very important structural context for the Holocaust. And finally, the question of the borderlands, which has been discussed the last 3 decades, which is very important, a very important perspective to show that these borderlands were contested since the end of the First World War. They were full of ethnic violence and so on, but the result is not different from other areas. So the Jews were killed both in the borderlands to 95%, but also in other areas which were not contested. So I think it's necessary to reevaluate the meaning of that concept for the Holocaust. Now I come to the context of Nazi violence in general. I already said there were approximately 3,000 to 4,000 Jews killed in Germany and Austria before the war. And of course, these Jews in first place, especially before the pogrom, were killed because they were criminalized or because they were public figures or politicians and so on and so forth. So the violence was in the context of other persecution. This changes then with the pogrom and especially during the war. The big break from individual killing to mass murder, as I said, was in 1939, and those were the 2 major instances, the euthanasia, which started at the end of 1939 in Poland and in 1940 in Germany proper, and then the killing of the Polish intelligentsia, according to Polish estimates, 60,000 persons. And this repeats to a certain extent also in summer 1941. The first killings of the Einsatzgruppen in the occupied Soviet Union were directed both at Jews and political enemies, or as Jews as political enemies, the so-called political functionaries and so on and so forth. And another important transitory step, I think, are the reprisal policies. The first killings of Jews in especially in Eastern Poland in July 1941, were declared as reprisals for Bolshevist crimes, for attacks on the German army and so on. And this was very important for the army to have a legitimization to kill civilians en masse. The next, you also see this in Serbia, of course, there the Jews, the male Jews were killed in context of the anti-partisan one. The next connection between non-Jewish and Jewish victims is the treatment of the Soviet POWs. Approximately 1 million POWs were already dead by the end of 1941. And there are close connections between both complexes of persecution. For example, the extension of Auschwitz to Auschwitz-Birkenau was related to Polish POWs. This should be a POW camp. Most of them died. And also when the POWs were dead at the beginning of 1942, only then the question arose, what kind of workforce will we have? And then this division between those Jews who are going to work, who are arbeitsfähig, able to work, and those who are going to be killed right away, starts right at this point in late 41, early 1942. And then, of course, after the main period of the Holocaust in 1944, 1945, the Jews enter the concentration camp system. They come from other camps, labor camps. They are being deported, evacuated, and then their fate is shared. They share the fate of other prisoners, though more Jews were killed than other prisoners during the death marches and so on. The relationship between the crimes against Jews and non-Jews is very important from the perpetrator sides, because we have the same perpetrator groups, those who shot Poles in 1940, then shot Jews in 1941. You have the same patterns of organization. You see this especially with Eichmann. And you have the same patterns of mass murder. For example, the applying Cyclone B. Was probably first applied in Poznan in 1939 against the Polish mentally ill. So, and it's the experience of killing which was already present, so it was not a big step for most killers in 1941 to turn to the final solution. Now to the collaboration, this important issue which has been overlooked by German historiography, according to Jan Grabowski in his new Haaretz article. I think the first thing we have to say about collaboration is it a useful concept or not? Because collaboration is very a concept which is related to national loyalty. So a collaborator is somebody who betrays his fatherland. And that's why I think it's in some cases highly problematic. For example, can you call a Lithuanian who was occupied in 1940 by the Soviet Union and then worked for the Germans in 1941 a betrayer of the Soviet Union? For example, this concept or this underlying structure of national loyalty. That's why I think it's not a perfect term, but it's difficult to replace it. And of course, we have very different patterns of collaboration. We have outstanding cases where states collaborate and on their own initiatives kill. That's Romania and Ustasha, Croatia. We have governments under occupation, like in Hungary 44, like Vichy government. And most important, of course, the police as decisive force, because the police not only gave the manpower, it knew the language inside, it had knowledge of the local circumstances, where do the Jews live, who is a Jew and who not, and the collaborators were very important for looking for the Jews and hiding the hunt for Jews, like Jan Grabowski called it. The interesting thing is that the fascists played a minor role in this collaboration. They played a role in the political collaboration, but in most cases they were not in government. Only in Croatia, in Norway, and October 1944 in Hungary, they came into government. Before that, the majority of collaborators or chief collaborators were conservatives, you can say, conservative specialists and so on. So it's only limited extent. In France in 1943, the milice takes over, for example. Then, of course, the decisive question about this is how decisive was collaboration? And I think collaboration is a very important element on the micro level for the Germans to persecute and kill the Jews. But there was comparatively few possibilities for the local people. Of course, they could leave the service and so on. But if you look at Western Europe, then collaboration is really decisive. If you look in the Belgium case, for example, there are the two important Jewish communities in Antwerp and in Brussels, and the Belgian police in Brussels did not take part in raids against Jews, but the police in Antwerp did. And that's the main reason why most of the Jews in Antwerp were killed and most of the Jews from Brussels were survived. So that's important to see how does collaboration work. And then we can argue collaboration is very important or is not so important. And finally, of course, the problem, can we call somebody who kills Jews, but also is a resist against the German, call a collaborator? And this is one of the main paradoxes of the new research, that we have persons who worked for the underground and at the same time killed Jews. So he did, in a certain sense, not violate his national loyalty, but nevertheless was an anti-Semitic killer. And we have to think about that problem a little bit more. And finally, the question is there a concept to get to come to grips with the collaboration in general? How is it related to colonial violence? How to collaboration, in quotation marks, of course it didn't exist under that term in the colonial world. That's just an idea. I'm going to shortly address, unfortunately I don't have my clock with me. I have to Probably I'm already over time. Yeah, a little bit. I skipped this limits of violence chapter a little bit. I just want to say that there was a variety of limits to Nazi violence, and the most important was the German discussion itself, and the Germans discussed killing all the groups except the Jews. There was a big discussion on whether to kill the Soviet POWs. There were even discussions to kill the Roma. There was never a clear line to kill the Roma within the Nazi leadership. Hitler never decided that, for example, and so on. And there are, of course, lots of other factors. I wrote them down. I won't go into detail. But I want to say something about impact the Holocaust had on societal change, and the other way around, how societal change had an effect on the Holocaust. And first thing is, of course, how did the Germans, including the Austrians, become so anti-Semitic? And that's, of course, a history of both coercion and consensus. Of course, we know that Nazi dictatorship was a consensus dictatorship, at least from the mid-1930s on, and that's very important. Other patterns we see in relation to the persecution of Jews are very similar with the societies under occupation, profiting from expropriation or from getting rid of competitors on the economic market are very important. And that's, of course, one of the driving forces of the Holocaust, no doubt about it. On the other hand, if we look at the societies, how they were affected by the Holocaust, we have to deal with the German and Austrian society, but especially with the Eastern European societies where the violence took place, where it took place inside the towns and cities or in the forests nearby, where everybody knew or could see what's happening now. And I think this heavily affected these societies, and a lot of locals said, I want to come to terms in good relations with the Germans, so I have to do something against the Jews or have to help them. On the other hand, this led to a new stratifications inside society. For example, if you look into villages, now the village policeman, the Polizei, how it was called in the Soviet Union, was the leading guy in the village, and often these were not from the local elite. And of course, we have to see the brutalization of society, especially in 1943, 1944, where all these killings of Jews by Poles on an individual basis took place. And soon after that, we had, again, especially in Eastern Europe, a second societal change with the Soviets coming back and so on, and the next period of social change. My final point is the Holocaust in history. I think we should have a little bit more turn back to a very old traditional approach, and that's how is the Holocaust included in the continuity of anti-Jewish violence, and we can even go back to the Middle Ages. And if you see, for example, the pogroms of the 14th century during the Black Death, it's already the attempt to exterminate whole Jewish communities, of course, on a quantitatively much smaller basis. You see it with the Khmelnytsky uprising in the 17th century in Ukraine. You also have the attempt to exterminate the Jews. And the same thing is to get their property. That's also, I think, a almost universal element, and especially the Jewish gold comes up in that period. And I think if you look at the local Poles in World War II, when they run into the ghetto after all the Jews have been deported, they look for the Jewish gold. The Jews must have hidden something. That's, I think, such a strong discourse over the centuries. We should go back to this continuity. The second approach, of course, is the most fashionable right now, is the Holocaust as genocide. I really appreciate the genocide research, but actually I have to admit that there were only few results which enhance Holocaust research in that. We know a lot about the Romanians now and Rwanda and so on and so forth, and something about common structure, but actually I don't see how it affected Holocaust research that much. My approach is a little bit more different, maybe not so new. I would say the Holocaust is a climax of an age of violence which started in 1929, 1930, and ended in 1952. And the interesting thing, it's not only these 2 years are not about Stalinism, but I start with the Italian colonial war in Libya. The Italians were the first to set up big concentration camps for the Libyan civil population. And then, of course, the whole violence comes in with collectivization in the Soviet Union, and come the Japanese in China, and so on and so forth. And it ends in China. Of course, it also ends in the Soviet Union, but it has been overlooked that the most terrible period of terror in China was not the Cultural Revolution, but the beginning, the early phase of the People's Republic. Approximately 3 million Chinese were killed there. So all in all, you have probably 30 million civilians killed in that period. And so what is common? That's my question. I see the ideology is important for these fascist and also Stalinist system. They are very dynamic movements, very youth directed movements. They most of them have new empire building, the ultranational, and this fragmentation not only of the international economy and system, but also of international law. And finally, my plea is to interpret the Holocaust as part of Nazi violence in general. That means we cannot, it's not about adding the other groups and respecting them, but it's about analytically integrating the violence against Jews and non-Jews, because only then you see what the specificity of the Holocaust is, what is different from the other groups. And I mentioned some of the things. So my summary ends with this: I think it's necessary to ask structural questions on all levels, the macro, the very big global level, you can see the meso level, which is national and regional, and the micro level, like Omer Bartov in his Bukchach study, what actually happened. And I always say general Holocaust historiography needs context. Its context is extremely important to explain things. And I think it's more important to do internal comparisons between groups, between regions, between ghettos and so on, than these external comparisons between apple and pear, Armenians and Jews. And I think we have here, during this period of the 30s to the early 50s, a shift in the political, cultural world. I think in whole Eurasia, that means from France to Japan, and we have to talk about that shift. And finally, if we want to draw lessons on it from the Holocaust, we have to see the whole spectrum of Nazi violence, because a lot of phenomena we see today are very similar to Nazi phenomena, but not to the Holocaust. For example, anti-partisan war, killing, reprisal killing, camp systems. You know, there was in the US this strange debate about the detention camps for the immigrants, whether they can be called concentration camps. And everybody was thinking about the Holocaust, but it's not the Holocaust, which is a comparable case, but other Nazi camps are to a certain extent comparable. That's why we have to keep in mind it's a broader phenomenon, and we have to adapt to that. Sorry, I was over time, but I'm done now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. And we have so many questions. Dieter, would you like to stop sharing the screen, or it's okay to leave it like this?
Yeah, I can share the screen. It's no problem. You mean that I answered directly?
No, okay. So
Yeah.
it's okay. I want to start with a question that I think will be interesting for all of us, and it's about the decision for the final solution.
Yeah.
So in your view, was the final solution the decision to kill all the Jews of Europe unleashed in one blow or in stages?
Yeah.
Were there at least two stages? The first in the fall of 1941 to kill all Jews in Eastern Europe, and then a second stage starting in the spring and summer of 1942 to kill all European Jews, including the Jews of Western Europe. So this is one question, and you know, maybe I can just go ahead and ask another question because we
yeah,
have
but maybe I answer directly to this because otherwise it's too complicated. I try to keep it short. I mean, it's a debate of 20 years, which is going. I think it's a process, and I think we start in March 1941 when the Nazi leadership was discussing whom to kill in the Soviet Union. At the same time, as I said, just a month later, the Ustascha starts killing Jews and so on. And then we have these stages inside the Soviet Union. And I think two important steps at the end of 1941. The one is September, October 1941. It's more or less the decision to kill the Jews in Eastern Europe. And you see it with setting up the camps. You see it with a second wave of mass murders. And probably Christian Gerlach is right that Hitler issued this central order in December 1941 for all of European Jews. But the whole preparation process took until spring 1942. So in the end, you can see the final solution as a concept was developed within a year from March or spring 1941 to spring 1942. That's my opinion. It probably comes a little bit close to what Chris Browning thinks about that.
Okay, Ronnie,
yes.
Do you have a question?
Thank you so much, Professor Pohl, for a fascinating presentation. I will start with a question by Rami from the chat. To what extent do you agree with Alon Confino's analysis that Jews were not so much a racially inferior race, but rather the essential enemy of the German Volk and a mortal danger to the existence of the German people?
Yeah, I agree with that. As far as I see it, Confino has a little bit more cultural argumentation. He says that the Jews were, I would say, even a global danger for culture. So it's this Jewish spirit. That's the important thing. And I think that's an important element. And then we come a little bit away from this racist or interpretation as racist. Because I think you have this common set of anti-Jewish stereotypes which runs through the ages, religious, economic, cultural, and so on. And there come two additional ones which are important. The one is the Jews as the founders of communism or the basis, Judeo-Bolshevism. And the other one is a global conspiracy. But I think this element of the Jewish spirit is very important because it addresses not only the Jews itself, but it also is a very important discourse in the early 1930s in Germany. There's this word Kulturbolschewismus. It's very undefined, but it's a danger for our identity. And I think that's an important element, but you shouldn't single it too much out. It's one, different groups had different motives to persecute and kill the Jews. This was one element, I would say. But the Nazi leadership in first place saw the Jews as a global danger coming from two sides, the plutocrats in the Wall Street and the Jews behind Stalin. That's the Hitler's view.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Would you say there is a relationship between violence and anti-Semitism? For example, in Western Europe, little violence was seen in the open, but in Eastern Europe, violence against Jews in the eye of the public was rather a frequent occasion.
Yes, of course. As I said, we have, I think, a completely different occupation policy, East-West, and a different public sphere. For example, if you look a little bit more, I would say, revisionist into Western European occupation history, you see that, for example, the Dutch had an economic boom under German occupation. So they won't admit that very much, but that's what new research says. The Flemish in Belgium had a cultural boom. So they were feeling quite well under German occupation. Of course, the national sovereignty was gone away. The French fared a little bit. But of course, in the West, this was considered both among the population and the Nazis as a civilized world. So actual killing of Jews in place started here only in 43, 44. You shouldn't underestimate the Germans and the milice killed approximately 2,000 to 3,000 Jews in France. They shot them. So, but that's in a very late period of the war, and it's then also connected to the invasion. So if there's a war, the whole situation changes. But in Eastern Europe, the Germans didn't care. You see the early phase of the mass executions in June, July, August 1941. These were public events. Everybody could go there, more or less. And then in August, the security police says, oh, that's not good for secrecy reasons and so on, and so we don't want that. But in general, if you look at the so-called ghetto clearances inside Poland, in the Baltics, and so they were extremely violent. I mean, you have corpses in the street later on. People could see it from their windows and so on and so forth. But from the German point of view, the society was paralyzed. The other thing is in how far this enhanced the anti-Semitism. And of course, societies in East Central Europe were much more anti-Semitic, like in Western Europe. This also has to do with democratic traditions and so on, but it's also, I would say, a cultural difference. So violence in general was much less visible in the West. Also, not violence, for example, like civil war violence and so on. But in East Central Europe, you have a period of violence which stretches from 1912, the Balkan Wars in the south, to 1948, where you have constantly civil war, mass murder, occupation, and then come the Soviets and so on, and it continues.
Thank you so much. Another question now from Alicia Marriott, a master student, who is asking about the representation of German children in literature. There have been some representations of children in both testimony and some in fiction, but not at the volume of survivor testimony. Why is it so difficult to discuss perpetrators, especially children who were legally pardoned by the war?
Yeah, that's difficult to answer. This applies to children who participated in anti-Jewish operations. Did I actually? We have that. I would say in two cases, it's very obvious. The one is a pogrom of 1938. During the pogrom, we have very detailed research. It's now clear that whole school classes were taken to the synagogues. So the teacher, especially if he was an ardent Nazi, and lots of teachers were Nazis, he took them to show them what's going on and how bad the Jews are, and now the revenge is being taken. And of course, you have lots of children, but especially those among the Hitlerjugend who participated in the pogrom. This was also afterwards, there was an investigation. And you have it returning in 1945 with the death marches. When the inmates of the concentration camps were herded through the villages and over the roads, you very often have it that they were attacked, maybe not so much by school children, but more, we have lots of instances by Hitlerjugend. And they thought now they can behave as Herrenmensch, as their master race. And you see, Danny Blattmann's research has shown that the Germans were very unfriendly to the death marches. And this had to do because they feared these are all Bolsheviks. They will steal our property and rape our women or whatever. And this also applied to the youth. And you have to see that the youth was highly radicalized, let's put it like that. In 1945, they were totally believers in Hitler, while most of the population knew the war is over. So let's try to survive and not go out. I think these are two instances where you can see it and where you can document it. There are lots of testimonies, not only by the Jewish inmates, Jewish prisoners who went on the death marches, but also from the German side. You can see this in a certain. In the other areas, it's much more difficult. There were children in the East. SS officers could take their children into the East, and there were exceptional cases where the children took part in anti-Jewish violence, like wives also, but it's very, very rare to find documentation.
Thank you. We have another question. How do you reconcile the imperial motivation that you spoke about with the notion that Poland was not initially a target of conquest by Hitler and the other Nazis?
Yeah, that's a big problem because what is not very commonly known, there was a Polish-German friendship in the 1930s. Hitler was astonishingly, he surprised the German elites by making a treaty with Poland in 1934. Poland was the enemy. The Poles took away our lands in the Versailles Treaty and so on. And Hitler thought different. He thought that he needs the Poles later for his war. But in 1939, this starts at the end of 1938 when the Poles resist against the offer to come close to Germany, more or less. He switches the side, and I think it's very important not to see only Hitler, but also the German elites, and they were highly anti-Polish. And what happens now is in 1937, the German-Polish friendship was held high in propaganda, but in spring 1939, the German propaganda switched, and the Germans were quite happy with that. They said, oh, the Poles, they stole our country, and the Poles are more primitive than we are anyway, and so on. So I think there was a kind of common sense. And for Hitler, he didn't care about the Poles. He didn't love them. He wanted to use them. So, and what actually I think was the context of making it an empire was that his plans for Lebensraum, living space, which were actually meant for the Soviet Union, he now thought if the Poles don't behave well, and they did not, I start with my Lebensraum right at my front door, more or less, and the Poles will have that. And then comes, of course, the revenge for Versailles and the reintegration of the eastern border. And you have to see this was highly popular to have cities like Torun also back into Germany, and there was a big consensus that we will throw all the Poles out of that. So I think in the German population, in the German elites, there was a high consensus that the Poles should be treated bad. And that was the basis. Of course, the empire building came from Hitler, not from the population. From Hitler and the elites, the plans were made by different branches of science and spatial planning, but it was quite easy. But I would say in the course of the planning of Hitler, it was quite surprising. That's true.
Thank you so much. We have only time for one more question.
Yeah. Okay.
Dozens of them on the chat, and I'll make sure to save it and to forward it to you. And it's very hard to choose, but so I'm just like picking one.
Yeah, go ahead.
That we haven't addressed yet. We have Bjorn who asks about the issue of Jan Garbowski's concern that the exclusive focus on German perpetrators by German historians ignores perpetratorship and complexity of non-German perpetrators. And so
yeah, that's one of the most important questions right now. But actually, I have to say, I like Jan Grabowski a lot personally, but I completely disagree with him. The first thing is there has been a lot of research on the collaborators. In my dissertation on Eastern Galicia, I have written a lot about the Lviv pogrom and the own representative auxiliary policemen. I think the best study by far on collaboration is Christoph Diekmann's study on Lithuania. He's the only study where he really understands the Lithuanians. That means he writes the Lithuanian history, the prehistory of the nationalist movement, and so on and so forth. And it's going about pages and pages. Now the only synthesis on collaboration in Europe, it's a 600-page book, appeared last year by the Kiel historian Klaus Kellmann. Where we differ is the role of the Germans. I wrote in, I think it was 20 years ago, I wrote a small book on the Holocaust, and I said, my estimate is that approximately 200,000 Germans, including Austrians and so on, were implicated in the Holocaust, killing the Jews. And I said, a much bigger figure of foreigners were participating in that, but not in leading positions. The only exceptions are Romania, to a certain extent Hungary and Bulgaria, but that's not what Jan Grabowski is talking about. And a final word about, we had a bad discussion, very unpleasant recently, because I said in his book on a Jew hunt, the Germans almost don't show up. It's only about Polish policemen and Polish peasants and so on and so forth. And he was heavily criticizing me. But on the other hand, you have to see what is the role of the Poles in the Holocaust. And the Poles were still, they collaborated, no doubt about that, but on a very lower level than in other areas. Look at Lithuania, in part at Ukraine, but look also at the other. And the Poles on their own initiative killed approximately 1 or 2% of the Polish Jews independently. That's my guess, 30,000, 50,000. He gives a very bigger figure, but that's unsubstantiated. So that's, at least you can say, a quantification. Of course, the Polish police was present during a lot of German operations, but how important were they? That's the other factor. So there were a lot of non-Germans helping the Germans on this low level, like the Poles. The real cases of collaboration are not the Poles. Those are the Romanians, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, on a political level. And you have to turn it the other way around. If the Germans wouldn't have had this local policeman, what would they do? And I think they would find, let's say, 1 or 2 people who denounced the Jews, and then they sent in a police battalion and do it themselves. So the question is, how important is collaboration in each and every case? And there you have to go to the micro level, actually. I think or somebody else mentioned it in the chat. You have to go on the micro level, and there you see how important they were. But what if you do counterfactual history and say, if they weren't there, what would have happened? Would the people have survived that? I don't think so.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking lecture and discussion. I'm sorry, guys, if you had any more questions. We are running out of time. And I want to give Dr. Boaz Cohen now the final words. Thank you so much, Professor Pohl.
Thank you.
Boaz, unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I can't have the final word after Professor Pohl because everyone has to know his place. But I will say that we always try to explain how we historians look at the world. And we say this American line from all the movies, we say it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated. You don't really have one answer that solves all the problems. You have context. What we saw in your presentation, and it opened a lot of avenues of thought. We in Western Galilee, we work on the issue of war and Holocaust. We see this, I think we're the only one teaching this in Israel. They are Holocaust together. So I think this understanding that things happen, a lot of things happen at the same time at a lot of places, and they all influence one another. This is something that you showed us very strongly. Maybe we could place your PowerPoint on the site where we will place the recording so that people will be able to see it. I think we all learned a lot. And the questions were also very good. Sorry, as Daniela said, sorry guys, we couldn't put everyone in, but the questions were good, and it was thought-provoking, and it really opens new directions we can still argue about. I mean, that's what studying is all about. Thank you for this. We really learned a lot, and thank you everyone for coming. If you didn't see the invitation, you will soon see the invitation to Christmas Browning lecture on the 15th of August. So see you soon, and thank you for coming in, and thank you, Professor Pohl.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Keep
Yeah,
safe,
you're welcome.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.